Okay, right. Welcome back, everybody. We are now going to do something a little bit different. This is going to be a round table, but it's not going to be a straightforward or simplistic round table because one of our guests isn't just sitting very still, zooming in and waiting to spring into action. Nick Timothy, if any of you have recognised him, he does look a little bit different actually. Nick Timothy has agreed to pre-record something for us. So talking about recording, I need to record this for now. Oh no, it is good. Nick has agreed to pre-record something, which is about 12 minutes long. So we're going to start off with that, and then we're going to bring our in-person panellists down to the front of the room. We're going to spotlight Tim Bale on the screen in some sort of Big Brother fashion again, and then we'll kind of have a discussion based on what Nick Timothy has just said and whatever else the panelists want to talk about, and kind of reflecting on the themes of the day. But to begin, let's see what Nick's got to say.
Johnsonism is many things, but first and foremost, it's a wasted opportunity, and one that on current trends could lead not to another decade in power for the Tories, as some were fantasising in 2019, but at the next election, perhaps, to defeated opposition. And the tragedy is, it could have been really very different.
It's incredibly quiet for us in the room. It's a rule that we have to have a technical problem with every single panel.
Get them steps in, which we try and get.
For a while, it seemed that the Johnson strategy was to capitalise on the realignment in British politics, to recast the Conservatives as a party for the provinces and working class voters. It seemed that the plan was to embrace the state and promote active government, and to become more robustly conservative on cultural issues, while moving away from austerity and to the left on the economy. This was the successful pitch at the 2019 general election. Johnson promised to deliver Brexit, reduce immigration and cut crime. He promised to fund public services, spend more and level up the country, bringing growth and opportunity to the regions. It brought the biggest Tory majority since Thatcher, and among many first-time Conservative voters who lent the party their support, precious goodwill. Now, to be fair, few prime ministers govern in the way they always imagined they would. Events often take over, and so it proved with Johnson. COVID was a crisis unprecedented in a modern economy. It consumed the attention of ministers and prompted record spending and record borrowing. Although serious mistakes were made, the public were understanding and forgiving, cognizant that the pandemic was an especially difficult challenge for governments right across the world. And the procurement and rollout of the vaccines was popular and a big success. So while COVID took up time and money, both precious commodities in government, it didn't fundamentally damage the Prime Minister or the Tories. What has quite obviously damaged the PM, and increasingly damages the Conservatives as a party, is the revelations about law-breaking in Whitehall. Whatever's going to unfold in the coming weeks and months, it's quite clear to me, and certainly clear to a vast majority of the public, that Johnson broke the laws he imposed on other people and then lied about doing so to Parliament and to the country at large. And whatever his allies say, I don't think there's any coming back from that. He's now a broken Prime Minister leading a stricken government. Some say that the problem is that the Tories have become unmoored, that they've won over their new electorate, and in winning over that electorate, they've strayed too far from their principles and got lost. They say that what the country needs and what the voters of the Red Wall want is truly conservative policies, and what they mean by that, I think, is not really conservative. They mean less spending, lower taxes, and a smaller state. But there's a lot to pick apart there. So first of all, the Tory comfort zone, a sort of neo-Thatcherism, more ideological than anything Margaret Thatcher did herself, is not really conservative. It's radical and potentially destructive to many communities, sectors of the economy and parts of the country. Second, with the changing demographic profile of the country, fewer workers and more pensioners, we're going to see greater demand for welfare, pensions, health and social care spending, and fewer people to pay for it. So an overall reduction in the tax base is I think, unlikely in the medium term. And third, while it's true that some of the supply side reforms the country needs involve changes in tax and regulation, house building, for example, or incentives to invest in R&D and machinery and tech, those necessary supply side reforms also require investment in infrastructure and education, in skills and training, and to stimulate and support both nascent and growing industries. And of course, supposedly true blue policies are neither what the Red Wall voters want. They, after all, had many opportunities to vote for this kind of agenda before and never did, nor is it what Brexit was supposed to be about, as you sometimes hear said. Leading Leave supporters might have spent the referendum thinking that Brexit might make Britain a kind of Singapore on Thames, but actually most Leave voters wanted national sovereignty, democratic control, and stronger solidarity between citizens. The referendum was won among voters protesting against the way the world economy had destroyed job security and killed wage growth. They were not voting for more of the same and more exposure to those kinds of dangers. So no, the trouble with the government is not that. It's that its reputation for honesty and probity has been shot to pieces, and it's also failed to deliver on the political offer made in the 2019 election. True, Johnson got Brexit done, and it's true that probably only he could have done so. After the mess he inherited from Theresa May, it took Johnson's roguish personality to smash through the stalemate. He did that through a combination of audacity, booting the Tory Remainers out of the party, artifice, agreeing the Northern Ireland Protocol knowing it would need to change, and chutzpah, claiming, incorrectly, there's a bit of a pattern there, that there would be no need for any checks on goods at all between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But he only got Brexit done up to a point. So there's still no convincing plan to resolve the Northern Ireland Protocol. The protocol's actually played its part in splitting the unionist vote, allowing Sinn Féin to become the largest party in the province and destroying the prospect of a resumption in government in Stormont. On immigration, free movement is no more, but Johnson has deliberately designed an ultra-liberal visa system. The numbers of people coming here are just going to keep going up and up. And this isn't happening by chance, it's done by deliberate design. So work permits are unlimited and the definition of skilled work has been watered down. The shortage occupation list was extended to allow the recruitment of foreign workers in lots more trades. Employers were no longer compelled to seek workers from the resident population before recruiting from overseas. A salary threshold supposedly set to ensure only high-skilled immigration was set at just over £25,000 and for some workers just over £20,000. Foreign students, whatever their qualification, were given the right to stay and work in Britain at the end of their courses. And just as Australia's points-based system was created to increase immigration, so the new British points-based system will also deliberately increase immigration. If you add to this rising crime, the failure to resist the rise of critical race theory and associated militancy in the public sector and society at large, the bizarre flirtation with trans rights and failure to stand up for women's privacy and security, and it's quite clear that Johnson isn't delivering on the cultural side of political competition. But unfortunately, on economic policy, things aren't much better there either. So Johnson's long been at war with Rishi Sunak over fiscal policy. He's briefed against him and set out to damage him as a potential successor. But in finding Sunak's fiscal conservatism a hindrance, Johnson has failed to ask some of the most serious questions. With household debt standing at 133% of household income, and post-crash QE having caused huge asset price inflation, how can we get our economy into a place where we have a normalised monetary policy brought into balance, a sustainable balance, with fiscal policy? How can we restructure our COVID debts, encourage productive investment, and achieve the re-equitisation of the economy? How we answer these kinds of complex questions will decide whether we go on to achieve strong, sustainable and non-inflationary growth. And they'll determine other calls too that we talk about, how we improve productivity, get better growth in pay, make sure that housing is attainable and affordable for young families. With the big economic promise Johnson made, which was to level up the country, we've seen very little progress. The data shows that in the 2 years since he became PM, London has only pulled further ahead of the regions. Michael Gove, as Levelling Up Secretary, has got plenty of ideas about what can be done, and I would say what he's done with the construction companies has been Rooseveltian and I think a good example of what the party should be like. But he hasn't been backed with big budgets or big economic policy changes that will help to achieve levelling up. And not even counting the rise of inflation that we're seeing at the moment, it's difficult to see how we can level up the economy without addressing the following 5 problems. 1, high immigration is likely to keep down wages and put pressure on infrastructure and services. 2, globalization and changes in world trade and technology are hollowing out the labour market and forcing more people into low-paid, low-skilled work. 3, low pay and high personal and household debt is acting as a brake on consumption-led growth and leaving us unable to break out from funny money monetary policy. 4, skewed investment and the dominance of institutions and companies in London and the southeast of England. And 5, policies that continue to reject a strategic role for government in driving change, an increase in domestic production and reshoring manufacturing, a commitment to keep vital industries in Britain and in British hands, and an improvement in training and paying conditions for workers. Johnsonism was supposed to address all of these things. It was supposed to be the people's government. It was supposed to become more interventionist in the economy and stand up to vested interests. It was supposed to be more muscular in its cultural conservatism and stand up and not just play silly games in the media to the ideological weirdos and grifters who promote what the tabloids call wokery. But it hasn't done these things, and along with the law breaking and subsequent dishonesty, this is why the government has become unpopular. And now we're likely to see a narrow, cynical, synthetic strategy with the forthcoming general election in mind. The sorts of deep policy changes I've just described will just be seen as barnacles that need to be scraped off the boat. Simplicity and dividing lines are going to be the order of the day. Johnsonism was supposed to be interventionism, patriotism, solidarity, sacrifice for your fellow citizens, a national project of renewal, growth and civic confidence experienced across every region of the country. But instead, Johnsonism now stands for survival, cynicism, selfishness, fecklessness, engineered controversies to divert attention from failure, the destruction of public trust in our most important political institutions. I say this and it upsets me. I'm a lifelong Conservative. I'm a Conservative with a big C and a small c. I voted for Brexit. I broke with my old boss, Theresa May, over her failure to deliver a meaningful departure from the European Union. I backed Boris early. I supported his Brexit deal. I cheered his election victory. But the interests of Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party have long been in divergence since he lied about his law-breaking. Johnsonism, I'm afraid, is now what's best for Johnson, whatever the cost to the Conservative Party. And the party and the country do need a change. But that agenda, what Johnsonism could have been, remains a really potent political proposition and a really serious agenda for government. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. We'll let him know he got a round of applause. Message him in Spain or wherever he is. Great. Okay. If I can invite our panelists to come down on this, wonderful. While they're doing that, I will introduce everyone as quickly as possible. I should have done that with Nick Timothy before he started. I'm sure most people know that he was Joint Chief of Staff to Theresa May between 2016 and 17. But joining us also, we have Victoria Hewson, who is the Institute of Economic Affairs Head of Regulatory Affairs. and she has published on the implications and opportunities of Brexit. And she's also a lawyer who has practiced in the fields of technology and financial services. We've got Antony Mullen with us as well, who's Senior Research Associate at the University of Bolton, also Director of the Thatcher Network. We'll plug the Thatcher Network a bit more in a moment or later. He also co-edited a collection of essays, Thatcherism in the 21st Century. And on the screen, peering down at us, is Professor Tim Bale, who's Professor of Politics at Queen Mary, University of London, and a specialist in British politics, especially the politics of the right. And he's also the author, amongst many, many things, of The Conservatives since 1945, The Drivers of Party Change, which we heard about a bit earlier. So thank you all for being here. Great to see you. I might try and turn the camera around that way so that Antony and Victoria can be seen. How does that look? All right-ish? Right. Okay. I think the best place to start off with this is to ask maybe for your responses to what Nick Timothy said, which was provocative, interesting, very well worded, I thought. Tim, do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and sorry I can't be there. Sounds like the sort of thing that people say at an awards ceremony, but obviously this is a roundtable on a very interesting paper by Nick Timothy, clearly fairly disillusioned with the Johnson government. Some would say perhaps he should never have had quite as much faith in Boris Johnson and his capacity to make the kind of changes that Nick Timothy, would have liked in the first place. But let's leave that aside. My initial reaction was twofold, really. I don't really recognise the picture of a government that has somehow abandoned the, for want of a better term, culture war or the war on woke. As someone who's not particularly, I have to confess, preoccupied with some of the kind of identity politics that people are talking about, either on the left or the right, I would say that the Conservatives never seem actually to shut up about quite a lot of these issues. We've already heard today about some of the arguments they're making to regulate the university sector in order to ensure free speech and so-called no platforming. We have in the Conservative milieu more generally, if we look at think tanks like Policy Exchange, a commitment to some would even say a kind of witch hunt against museums and other institutions that seek to, as they would see it, overturn or rewrite history. And that is backed up by the words that we've heard on numerous occasions by the man who is now the chairman of the Conservative Party, Oliver Dowden, but was the culture secretary. He has on many occasions waded into those kinds of issues as well. A whole bunch of other ministers has done the same. His successor, Nadine Dorries, is famous for so doing, as is, of course, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. And of course, we've already heard about some of the groups of Conservative MPs that specialise in this, including the so-called Common Sense group. And I can very much recommend you reading their book, which is online, if you'd like to see where socially conservative MPs are going with all of this. Certainly, I don't think I am saying that as someone who could be labelled a cultural Marxist himself, but it seems to me that the Conservatives have not abandoned that territory, and indeed continue to pursue it, believing that it is electorally fertile ground for them. That says something very interesting does seem to be happening on immigration, both in terms of the increased numbers coming in, particularly from outside the EU, and the public's tacit acceptance of that influx. I think the Rwanda plan clearly is a headline grabber, and it's designed to, in some ways, protect the Conservatives' flank when it comes to small boat migration across the Channel, just in case Nigel Farage or anyone else should decide to make a big thing of that. But in some ways, you can argue it's also a distraction technique from the much larger influx coming in through work permits, coming in through, once again, family reunion, and a regime that, as Nick Timothy said, has actually been designed in some ways to be more liberal, certainly more liberal than the one that many people might have expected. So I think what's interesting about that is previously we've always seen public concern track numbers. So in other words, when the numbers go up, the public tends to get more concerned. But I would say that suggests to me anyway, that actually the missing link is the treatment of the issue by the party and the media, by the Conservative press and Conservative commentators on broadcast as well. It no longer seems a particularly worrying aspect of policy for the Mail, for the Express, or indeed the Telegraph. They continue to worry about migrant boats coming across the Channel, but they don't seem to worry too much about large numbers of people coming in from the Indian subcontinent, from Africa, etc., to fulfill shortage jobs. So I don't think that link is necessarily permanently broken. I think it can be reforged or revitalised. But for the moment, it is true that the Conservative Party seems to have gone quiet on that. So that's the caveat to my disagreement in some ways with Nick over the culture war. Crime's quite interesting as well. That is a perennial, clearly, and that's something that Nick talked a lot about. I'm writing a book at the moment on the party since Brexit, and I really have lost count of the number of crime weeks that have appeared on the party's media grid over the last 2 or 3 years. But they seem to have made very little difference to the numbers, or indeed to concern among the public about rising crime, particularly with regard to antisocial behaviour. And I think that obviously is because the causes of that kind of crime and other kinds of crime are to some extent driven by deprivation, by inequality, decline of traditional and institutional constraints on behaviour. Now, turning to the economy, which is the second thing that really struck me, I'm not really in the least bit surprised about the difference between what Nick Timothy would like to have seen and what we're actually getting from the Conservatives. Research that we carried out when I was at UK and Changing Europe in the Mind the Gap report, which you can find online, and revealed that there was an absolutely huge gap between the fundamental values on the economy between, on the one hand, voters, and particularly voters who'd switched from Labour to the Conservatives in 2019, and on the other hand, Conservative MPs. Conservative MPs, whatever the talk by Boris Johnson of levelling up or even redistribution we've heard today, remain essentially small state, low tax, low spend Conservatives. Now, of course, it is the case that when their constituents are hurting, as they would have been had nothing been done during the pandemic, or they are doing, and now that we have this cost of living crisis, then Conservative MPs will demand that something must be done. But I think it has to be seen very much, as far as they're concerned, as a set of emergency measures from which they would like to get away as soon as possible. And I think that is also the attitude of Rishi Sunak, who it seems to me is right where most Conservative MPs are. He is very much a kind of Thatcherite Conservative, as are the vast majority of MPs. I also would like to caution anybody, and I see this a lot in the media, wanting to read across from the constituencies that a particular MPs, constituencies that particular MPs have won, and their ideology. It is often assumed, really, that someone sitting for a so-called red wall seat will necessarily be more centrist or somehow left-wing than somebody sitting for a so-called blue wall seat. I don't think that's the case at all. I think to get elected as a Conservative MP, you not only have to be Eurosceptic, you do also have to be quite Thatcherite when it comes to the state. And
Tim, I'm gonna stop you there just for a second, because I promise I will come back to you, and there's loads of really interesting stuff. I want to get Victoria and Antony's kind of just initial reactions to.
I'd actually finished anyway. So
I really apologise. Really apologise for cutting you off.
I was told 10 minutes, so I talked. 10 minutes. Right.
I apologise for cutting you off just when you were naturally finishing anyway. I was sensing a bit of a natural kind of finish, but thank you. That's wonderful. We'll come back to you shortly. Victoria.
Thank you. Very interesting from Nick's view. I guess if you follow his recent writing in his Telegraph column and so on, not particularly surprising, but always very lucid and interesting comments. I think it seems to me though that in terms of economic policy, my impression is that he and Boris Johnson have similar sort of goals and policy objectives and similar ideas in mind for the means to.
Sorry,
the microphone can't move much further, so would you mind moving to this chair, Victoria? Sorry. Okay, you will be picked up very, very easily there.
Yes, so it seems to me that on economic policy, that Timothy and Johnson are quite aligned. It's just that Nick Timothy seems to think that Boris is incapable of executing the kind of big state, I think he said strategic state intervention in the economy in the interests of solidarity and what I suppose Johnson would call levelling up. And that's very much where I part company with both of them. These seem to me to be very much the failed policies, big state policies, industrial strategy of the past. The use of the term Rooseveltian it just makes me shudder in horror, to be quite honest. And it does worry me that this seems to be where the debate lies now in Conservative economic policy making. Contra the assertion, I respectfully disagree with Tim. Although certainly Sunak had a past where he was seen as being a free market, almost Thatcherite politician, we're certainly not seeing that in practice. And the same really with other now senior cabinet ministers like Kwasi Kwarteng, who he used to write books for the IEA that were extremely sound, dry, Tory, Thatcherite. And now he's nationalising things and subsidising things all over the place. So as I say, I find it rather dispiriting that the debate seems to be very much focused on just the best way of technocratically executing big state interventionism, rather than pro-growth supply side reforms, pro-market reforms. Frankly, even the policies of the current government that purport to be pro-market, for example, interventions in digital markets, are really just protectionism and interventionism and a planned economy with a sort of framing of being pro-market. So that's all rather crushing for free market Thatcherite Conservatives like me. And on the culture war, sort of social policy things, I think probably the government's done okay there. I think they gradually started to stand up to things like gender ideology, which Nick Timothy alluded to, which has been useful to the extent that the Conservative Party can be seen as essentially a bulwark against the left and socialist and Labour parties getting in and doing something worse. Then arguably on that level, the Johnson government has been relatively successful. But I think, you know, if for people like me who hold that conservative and conservative values involve limited government, low taxes, maximum autonomy, minimal top-down control, then, you know, clearly the kind of big spending, centralizing projects that that Boris Johnson has always been keen on. He used to call himself a Brexity Hezzer. I don't know if anyone recalls that particular turn of phrase, and that's basically what we've got. So I think when that perhaps might be seen as one of the few times when his rhetoric has actually delivered something in reality, although, as Nick Timothy might argue, his execution of the Heseltonian type policies perhaps hasn't been the best. And I think the other interesting thing is the, and I don't think Timothy mentioned this, is the commitment to net zero and the green agenda, which, you know, arguably again is a very unconservative proposition because it's a rather ideological, very centralized, very top down, actually quite authoritarian policies involved in delivering net zero. And we're really, you know, ordinary people are suffering the consequences of that in our energy bills and so on. And if they adhere to that, then that's only going to get worse. So I wonder actually what Nick would make of that side of things, because again, I would consider that adherence to this ideology with a very authoritarian way of delivering it is profoundly unconservative, although I really don't want to get into the whole no true Scotsman sort of style of debating who's a true conservative or not. So shall I leave my
That's great.
there?
That's
Yeah.
great. We'll bring you in a moment. Anthony, your responses or your sort of initial thoughts?
So I think I would disagree with Nick Timothy in another area, because towards the end of his video, he said that Johnsonism is now at odds with the Conservative Party. It is all about Johnson. I would argue that Johnsonism has always been about that he has no genuine, real, deep-rooted beliefs of his own, that he is a superficial person who is self-serving, a person with not much depth, a person who is questionable character, but somebody who is a character in the sense that he is affected. The current Northern Ireland minister, Conor Burns, once showed me an email from him, and they had personal friends, and to his friends, he signs all his emails Alex, not Boris. Boris is the character, and I think that explains in part why he has the obsession with Churchill, because Churchill to Boris, and this goes back to what Robert was saying earlier, is, I think, an image, a certain type of politician and wartime leader, and he wants to appeal in the same way to the electorate now as an image, as a certain type of person. But there is no Churchillism, and I would argue there is no real coherent ideological Johnsonism. He is somebody who is a performer and appeals in a celebrity kind of manner. And I think one of the implications for the Conservative Party is that what he's done is created a cult of personality. So within the cabinet, he's appointed loyalists. He's got rid of the kind of heavyweights we talked about earlier and brought in people like Nadine Dorries, who really, I would argue, doesn't really belong in the cabinet, and has cemented his position by surrounding himself by those he sees being inferior to himself. Sam Friedman tweeted the other day that he was bewildered by how intelligent and successful people submit themselves to humiliation to protect a man who wouldn't piss on them if they were on fire. The withdrawal of the whip from the Brexit rebels, I think, was a means of stopping the challenge within the party. He has, on the Conservative Party shop, or the CCHQ website, you can buy packets of mugs and coasters which feature Disraeli, Churchill, Thatcher, and Boris Johnson. So it gives a sense of how he and the party see him as one of the big four of the last couple of 100 years. CCHQ staffers who refer to him, I think, wincingly as the boss. But what I think can be said is that he does, even though I'm saying all of this as a point of criticism, he commands a level of loyalty that somebody like Keir Starmer doesn't. So if you look at the defence of Johnson over his various rule breaks, there were people who were willing to come out and humiliate themselves in order to defend them. But where were the people doing that for Keir Starmer? They simply didn't exist. And that's because I think he has been successful in cultivating that cult of personality in a way that other politicians possibly couldn't. Coming back to Nick Timothy and the broader programme for government that he referred to, I think we have to see Nick's comment in the context that Boris, as Victoria was pointing out, has really continued something that Nick Timothy started in government with Theresa May. It failed under her because she was overtaken by circumstance. And it's telling, I think, that some of the more Thatcherite, more ideological members of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, two examples you say, John Redwood and Steve Baker, both backed Boris Johnson in order to deliver Brexit, which they both supported. But at the conference we held in Oxford a couple of years ago, John Redwood was asked, is Boris Johnson a Thatcherite? He laughed to himself. And I'll not quote him directly because I can't remember the words, but he made some comment about how Boris Johnson was essentially just a vessel in his own person. He was his own type of person. But I think that is how they see him. I think people of that ERG nature, they saw him as a vessel to get something done, which is what he promised, but not of the same ideological ilk as them. And of course, the other thing that led them to back Boris Johnson was they were in a position where there was a chance they could have lost to Jeremy Corbyn, and he would have delivered a real socialist agenda that would have been even worse than what Nick Timothy had dreamt up under Theresa May. And those two things, of course, Brexit and Corbyn, were the reasons that the public backed Johnson as well. And I think for all of his flaws, when you're standing next to Jeremy Corbyn, it's fairly obvious why he gets such a large majority when faced with the choice of somebody who is perhaps a fragrant liar, or on the other hand, an anti-Semite. So in he comes. So in general, I think you can criticise Boris Johnson for a lot. I think Johnsonism has always been about the character, about the person, rather than about any kind of grand ideological platform. He's inconsistent in what he believes. He's referred to frequently as a natural libertarian, but all of his instincts, even as Mayor of London, have been actually fairly authoritarian. He's managed to say one thing about himself and cultivate an idea, whilst what he's delivered has been completely contrary to that. Just as a closing comment, I think Nick Timothy might get the kind of economic programme that he wants in the near future delivered by Rachel Reeves. And the reason I say that is because Boris Johnson built a coalition in 2019 of two types of voter: the traditional older Conservative voters, people who've always voted Tory, and the new people who very much were Boris's people, and the kind of people who saw Boris as a bit of a lad and they quite liked him, and he appealed on Brexit and helped them to win over those red wall seats. But I think that coalition has become fractured for two reasons. The first is that in addition to academia, I'm also councillor in Sunderland for the Conservative Party, and this year I've spoken to about 700 people myself. It became very clear that traditional Conservative voters are disgusted by his behaviour in office. It's not so much the new people I found that he brought over in 2019, they were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. They voted Conservative because of him. But I think that part of this coalition will be hit hardest by the cost of living, which he hasn't properly dealt with. And so the two elements of the people who delivered his premiership for him, I think will leave him, one, because of his personal behaviour, and two, because of his policy decisions.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to each of you for just a brief thought on a couple of what I think, anyway, have been the core themes running through today. And one is, this idea of is Johnson a Conservative? It hinges on what do we mean by Conservative, or what kind of Conservative. There is a definitions element to today, isn't there? So you might well just say no, but to your mind, if he is a Conservative, what kind of Conservative is he? And also something else I think that's featured today too is that there is lots to be critical about with Boris Johnson, in many ways justifiably. But if you could pinpoint his greatest attribute, either personal or political, what is it? So on those two brief thoughts, I might just go in the same order again. So Tim, what do you reckon?
I suppose in terms of his greatest attribute, it would be his ability to convey a sense of optimism to the electorate, a sense that things will be getting better, and that, however vague, he has some sort of vision for the country that involves sunlit uplands, and somehow him helping the country get there. In terms of is he a Conservative or not, I mean, I suspect that underneath, if he had his druthers, he would not want to spend too much money, not want to tax people too much, not want to interfere too much in the economy more generally, and indeed in people's lives. So I think the characterization of him as a kind of libertarian Conservative, at least in terms of his instincts, is probably quite correct. But I think, as we've already heard, he wears whatever ideology he subscribes to, if that's the right word, pretty lightly. I think, as we've already heard, what's best for Boris Johnson, he tends to think is therefore best for the country and best for the Conservative Party. And I don't think it really goes very much deeper than that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Victoria.
Yes, I think in terms of an attribute, I would say that similarly to Tim, I think his way of communicating with people and engaging people has been a great strength. I was just saying before that I've came relatively late to the world of politics and policy, and I just used to enjoy reading his newspaper columns. I thought they were funny, and I thought he sounded like the kind of guy who would not end up being hidebound in intrusive nannying kind of policies, which of course is exactly what he has done. And I would say, actually, aside from the economic policies, which I think are much more possibly validly debatable within different schools of thought within conservatism, there are other aspects of the current policy agenda being pursued by the Johnson government that I just find utterly repellent and profoundly unconservative. I mentioned net zero. I think the COVID lockdowns, while I don't actually blame Boris Johnson for that too much, I think that was profoundly unconservative. But perhaps less contentiously than those two, the online safety bill, football regulation, these are the most unconservative things that are essentially attacks on our fundamental freedoms of association, freedom of expression. They devalue personal and family responsibility. They devalue civil society and private property institutions. I mean, what's a more successful manifestation of grassroots civil society and private self-regulated industry than the English Premier League and English football generally, actually throughout the whole pyramid down to the semi-professional clubs. And yet a Conservative government wants to regulate that like financial services for some weird reasons to do with heritage and market failure that have not been made out at all. I actually found that one of the most dispiriting pieces of regulation that I've been working on recently. And I guess also maybe the failure to roll back some other legacies of New Labour, going back to my discussion earlier, a return to the status quo ante before New Labour started vandalising our constitution might have been quite welcome. Looking at things like the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, thankfully they are looking at. We'll see where that's going in the next couple of weeks. So I think the most unconservative things, or possibly the things that we could be most surprised about by Boris Johnson, actually in particular, considering his past as being this fun-loving, almost libertarian, although I would question the use of that term there. And we've ended up with some of the most intrusive, nannying, interventionist policies into areas, as I say, of personal and family responsibility, which I think is rather worrying.
Okay, thank you. Antony, your thoughts on those issues?
I think his greatest attribute is the fact that he's genuinely quite likable. When I met him a few weeks ago, forgot that I disliked him because he's funny and he can tell a joke that makes you laugh, and he can be quite disarming. And you can see why he earned the name the Greased Piglet, because he is able to charm and to use his sense of humour and to get himself out of quite difficult situations because he's entertaining. And that goes back to my initial comment when I said that he's cultivated this sense of celebrity. He's created Boris, the character, that is quite warm and likable. Whether that's genuinely who Alex, who signs the emails off as Alex, is, I don't know, but he's created a public image of somebody who is likable and almost isn't prime ministerial, and it's like we've elected a celebrity as our prime minister, which fits in with what Robert was saying earlier about social media culture and that kind of appeal. When people watch the news or consume media, that probably don't do them, but many of us will quite deeply interested in current affairs. But if you were somebody who goes home and watches the headlines in the news at 10, or watches Good Morning Britain for 10 minutes on the morning, Boris cuts through really well. You get a couple of seconds of him, and he's likable in those few seconds. He knows how to present himself. I think that's his greatest talent. What type of Conservative is he? I think anybody who knows the Conservative Party membership can probably see how he fits in quite well, because the Conservative Party, I think, is full of people who don't really believe anything. They admire Churchill and Thatcher and they quite like them, but their views aren't all coherent, and I'm sure Tim will say a lot more about this than me, but there isn't this strong, my impression is, ideological sense of a coherent core. I was listening to a podcast on the way down here where Tom Tugendhat was talking about, is Boris Johnson a Conservative? And he said, well, yes, of course he is, because our one binding factor is we don't want socialism, and that is the kind of key definition of what a Conservative is. And if Boris Johnson doesn't want socialism, then by that definition he is a Conservative. But his to try and put into context the things Victoria was mentioning there about regulation, I think in general public in Britain is not the freedom-loving kind of people that the likes of Daniel Hannan talk about. I think we're actually quite nimbyish and authoritarian, and Boris Johnson's quite good at picking up on that instinct and feeding it. Whether or not that's the right thing to do as a Conservative Prime Minister is a separate question, but I think he certainly is able to pick up on the kind of public concerns and to appear to be able to offer a strong manner response to it.
Conservatism is what I say it is. I mean, just to pick up on something you were saying there a moment ago, and also building from what we heard from Rob in his keynote, something I think when I'm at my most grumpy about my country is that in some ways we are very frivolous, just in general, and is a quite frivolous prime minister, a celebrity culture prime minister, a reflection on the country at large, do you think, Antony?
Well, I don't think so, because clearly his reputation has completely gone down. I think he's at the minute as unpopular as Corbyn was. So there has been a visceral response to what he's done, and there are still, I think, standards that people have for how a prime minister should behave. Had he not broken the laws that he said, he might have got away with it. We might have accepted a prime minister who was unconventional and a bit extraordinary and a bit out there. But when that bleeds into a prime minister who is quite outlandish and is not following the same rules as us, who sees himself as exceptional, I think that's when it starts to affect public opinion, and people think actually we're not willing to put up with that anymore.
Tim, have you got any thoughts on what you've just heard? Oh, I think you're on mute. Sorry.
I mean, I do think this characterisation of what makes a Conservative, well, it's someone who simply wants to keep the Labour Party out and the Socialists out, has got a lot going for it actually over the years. You know, that's it seems a very sort of basic reductionist definition of what a Conservative is, but it does have the incredible merit of actually, you know, allowing us to unite a very disparate bunch of people, both across time and indeed across space. So I've got a lot of sympathy with that. I still would, I think, cavil at the idea that this government is particularly authoritarian or particularly interfering. By instinct, anyway, I do think a lot of what we've seen have simply been emergency measures, which this government has taken, with a good deal of regret and very often a good deal of hesitation. If we go towards the lockdown measures, for example, I mean, it is no exaggeration to say that we may well have lost tens of thousands of people to COVID, who we need not necessarily have lost had we taken measures earlier. And the refusal of Boris Johnson and indeed of Rishi Sunak to take those measures earlier does have something to do, I think, with an instinctive liberalism, and also, to be honest, with a concern for the economy. And I think seeing the economy versus healthcare as some sort of zero-sum game, some sort of trade-off, when most public health experts and indeed a lot of economists would say that you can't have one without the other. So I do think that instinct is still very, very strong, and indeed, as I say, actually in some ways mortifyingly and mortally strong.
Thank you. Before I do want to go to questions, because I'm keen to hear from people. Do you want to just respond to that, though, Victoria? That sort of idea that lockdowns were necessary and weren't that authoritarian.
I'm not going to pick back over all of the lockdown debates. I mean, I would say that as we've now got, with the benefit of a little bit of distance and a lot more data, I think the suggestion that lockdowns were necessary at all is now rather contentious, given that the evidence seems to show that it doesn't really matter what countries did. They all sort of ended up in the same ballpark, particularly by reference to Sweden. I mean, in terms of the general authoritarian tendencies, what I would say is that I'm not sure, I think it's probably right to say that the Prime Minister and ministers themselves don't particularly have these authoritarian tendencies. It's just that they are being steered by officials in their departments towards these policies that are being sort of presented as being pro-market, or somehow that, I think the former health minister, James Lord Bethel, was arguing that the proposed bans on buy one, get one frees are actually free market pro-freedom measures, because obesity makes you less free. And somehow they've been drawn into these nanny state blob type policies that they don't seem to have either the desire or the intellectual firepower to resist and build a principal case against them. So I think it's probably right that they perhaps don't necessarily have particularly authoritarian tendencies, but they're a bit managerial, and these policies just somehow get developed and take on a momentum of their own.
Thank you. There's a really interesting question in the chat, and it says, is the loss of discipline, rebelliousness, etc., among the Tory, the parliamentary party since the 2019 election a contingent product of mistakes made by him, by which I assume that means the Prime Minister, or is it more structural? There's ideological divisions. Who would like to field that question? Go on, Tim.
Well, I mean, for one thing, I mean, it's really in some ways the culmination of a process that's been going on since the 1970s, isn't it? I mean, as Philip Norton's work and obviously Phil Cowley's work has shown, discipline, which was iron before then, began to break down. And I do think it's probably got worse for a number of reasons. One is because access to the media, and particularly social media, means that almost any Conservative MP can become a legend in their own lunchtime in 5 minutes nowadays. I think it's also got to do in part with changes in the House of Commons, so that it's possible to make a career now as a select committee chair, where it wasn't before, and therefore that gives people a platform, as well as obviously social media giving them a platform. I think David Cameron becoming leader after just 4 years in the Commons was also very significant. I think it's a cliche to say that every backbencher has a field marshal's baton in their knapsack. But I think there are an awful lot of backbenchers who are convinced that they should be rising more quickly and that they could do a much better job than many in the cabinet. And looking at the current cabinet, of course, their critics would say, well, that possibly actually is the case in that case. So I think there are some sort of longer term structural reasons. I also think actually there is a contingent reason, which is COVID. I do think the fact that MPs spent a lot of time in their constituencies rather than at Westminster huddling together, apart from obviously on kind of WhatsApp groups, meant that it's been more difficult for the whips to install a kind of esprit de corps, among the new entrants in particular. And I think the rise of the various groups that we've seen, in part is due to the media's tendency to take those groups perhaps more seriously than they ought to, partly because they are just a very useful organising concept for journalists. If you're going to book an MP, it's much better if you can book an MP and say he or she represents the CRG or the ERG or whatever, than he's just Fred Bloggs from this particular constituency.
I'm not going to put every question to all of you, just because I want to get more from the audience. Martin.
Can I ask the panellists, since we've started this panel, the news has been announced that Boris Johnson has rewritten the ministerial code.
Oh, there we go. Can you imagine how topical that would be?
No longer requiring resignation in the event of breaking the ministerial code.
Wow.
So it's personally watered down. Can I ask the panellists' reactions to this?
Just in case people didn't hear that, Martin was saying that the news has apparently just broken that Boris Johnson has rewritten the ministerial code so that resignation is not required in the same way I see for things like lying to the House of Commons. If that is actually the cabinet saying you're lying, but if that's the case, that's filtered down to us. If that's filtered down to us accurately, that's very, very interesting. What do you make, Antony?
Well, I already think he should resign. I've said as much on World at One. I've got a very kind message from Tim, who's behind me, talking about my balls of steel for doing so. Very grateful for it. It's just absolutely repulsive, because the fact is he's a liar. He has lied, and now he's trying to make consequences for his lies. It's not something which we should put up with.
Really, I was just thinking of like the hierarchical farces and how it get the.
That's another view, but as I was saying, I think it's repellent that politicians can lie and then use their positions to, their position, his position, to remove the consequences for doing so.
Yeah, I agree.
Go on.
Yeah, I think it definitely seems a bit unseemly to do it so quickly. I must say, he could have, let things settle down and then sort of at least go through even if it's a rather superficial process of saying, oh, we've had a look at the ministerial code and decided it needs to be refined. Doing it right away does seem a bit, unseemly is probably the best diplomatic word. That said, I can't get too excited about it in substance. I mean, how long has the ministerial code even been a thing? It's about 10 years. Yeah, so it's not as if it's an ancient part of our constitution. And I'm always more of a fan of political accountability over this kind of technocratic code-based accountability. So I think I agree, it looks terrible, but in substance, I don't really care too much.
Someone in the chat is also saying that knowingly misleading comments is still a resignation issue. It's not a change on that knowingly misleading bit, which obviously is one of the headline grabbers. Says Mark in the chat. Anyway, we'll all find out shortly, I assume. There's lots of people I know in the room. Tim, let's have your view. There's a desire in the audience to hear from you on this.
Oh, on the ministerial code?
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's just, it's what we would expect, really. I mean, I don't think it's going to make that much difference. I think he was always going to go on this knowingly point, intentionally. When actually, as we know from when Amber Rudd resigned, that wasn't necessarily something that you had to prove. But by stressing that, I think he's probably assuming he's got a get out of jail free card. You know, and looking at the Sue Gray reports, you know, maybe he has.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, just for Victoria. It does seem that at least minimal government intervention is needed to address the climate crisis, because the market incentives just aren't there to bring about the change quick enough. Now, the climate crisis would certainly see a breakdown in these structures, these constitutional structures, these social structures that are essential to the clear functioning of society. And by rejecting any government intervention, it seems that free marketeers are being the ideological ones and really neglecting that conservative principle of pragmatism and accepting that sometimes government intervention is necessary. I just want to know what you think about that.
Well, for a start, I didn't reject the proposition of any government intervention whatsoever in respect of climate change. I would also push back on the phraseology there about climate crisis. We're not in a climate crisis. No scientist uses that phrase. It's not in the IPCC reports. It combined with some press stuff, and I don't think even the Climate Change Committee uses the terminology climate crisis, apart from in its informal sort of press release or informal statements.
Ecological breakdown then, I would say.
Well, we're not in ecological breakdown. We're not in ecological breakdown.
Okay.
However, as I say, I don't reject any government intervention in the interests of whether it's conservation or climate change mitigation. But what I do reject is the proposition that we need a fixed date of 2050 and a fixed target of net zero, which is totally arbitrary. The climate doesn't know what year it is. And trying to engineer through centralized processes of subsidies, taxes, direct interventions in industries is extremely inefficient. And it's actually not, even if the UK does get to net zero by 2050, that's not going to make the slightest bit of difference to global temperatures, but it's going to make us all a lot poorer.
Yeah, especially if China is going on it.
Exactly, while the rest of the world carries on.
What about direct intervention in the energy markets? I mean, probably very few people will know that the delivery price. We actually got a glut of natural gas in this country at the moment, because we have these basically they come in,
Ports,
ports, right? And we're actually shipping it across the continent. The spot price for the delivery to the following day, as it's gone up now, it was 35 pence a firm last week. It went up to £1 a firm. So the thing is, we've got no storage in this country. You know, but so we've left it to the companies to do their things. And rather than sort of take a national strategic view over this, I mean, we could be in a position where we're actually filling our storage up with 35 pence a firm at the moment, but we're not. We're shipping it across off to the companies are shipping it across to the continent to size of £4.50. You know, but the consumers and us are all going to pay for it. You know.
I mean, I think, as I understand it, though, the decision to cut back on our storage was a government decision, which is, you know, now looking, perhaps even at the time, it looked a bit like a slightly risky decision, and it now looks like an absolutely terrible decision. But I think, you know, the energy market is a good example, perhaps, of an industry that does need a regulatory framework because of all of the various complexities and externalities involved. It's clearly not working out very well at the moment, and that's probably because there's so much intervention. I don't know if anyone's had a look at Dieter Helm's work on energy markets before. It's absolutely fascinating, and probably I found the best starting point to go to try and understand it all. And he's catalogued, you know, all of the regulatory interventions that are in place at the moment. And his view is that nobody, even the experts in the industry, the experts in BEIS, could possibly understand it because there's just too much and it's too complex. And that means that it's actually acting against its stated objectives.
this is important and fascinating. I'm conscious about not going too far down one of these rabbit holes, but thank you for that. Yes.
I just had 2 quick points, which one of which may already be asked. I was just going to say it's probably in Johnson Victoria and people on the sort of the more neoliberal right, harking back to a kind of a free market era. I mean, I've just finished reading the official analysis of the 2019 general election, and unless I've misread things, the conclusion I came to was that although there's been fluctuations in recent years, in general terms, over say the last 30 years since the end of Thatcher era, voters have broadly moved to the left on economics and are more supportive of state intervention, and that actually could be a legacy of the Blair era, actually. And although I'm not personally a fan of Johnson, I actually don't think he's a stupid man, and I actually think he understands that. And I actually think that in the context of COVID as well, and all the intervention that went on there, he's actually just being a pragmatist. And I think echoing what we've just said before, this idea that we're going to go back to a small state, rolling back the frontiers again, in the context of what's gone on in the last couple of decades, I think is total wishful thinking. And I think if the Conservatives did go down that route, my own view is it would be an electoral disaster. So I think the right-wing critique of Johnson is actually something you can probably live with, because I think he would probably conclude that's a recipe for an electoral disaster. And the other quick point I'd just like to say, there was a comment made by Antony that said, oh, you know, when it came to the choice of 2019 general election, we had Johnson versus Corbyn, who you allege was an anti-Semite. But I mean, you know, we're not getting into that debate. If people at the time had done the digging, they would have, I'm not trying to get a level of sort of, a low level here, or a low bar, but Johnson himself was no paragon of virtue even then. Had a long history of making racist comments, not only anti-Semitic comments, comments against a whole range of groups, Muslims. He'd make remarks against the homosexual community, etc., etc. He had a reputation for lying. He allegedly given that information about friends who were journalists to be beaten up. All this sort of information was out there. So to suggest he's suddenly become a kind of moral degenerate and wasn't in 2019, I think is a bit of a rewriting of history.
Oh no, I wasn't suggesting he wasn't then, but tying in with my other point, he's got the ability to become quite a likable person and allow that to slip off him. Corbyn didn't. Corbyn would snap at journalists and shout back, and he came across as quite angry. The other difference is with Boris Johnson's comments in newspapers and so on, I think there was a distinct marked difference between that and the fact that the Labour Party had become institutionally anti-Semitic, was under investigation, and it was, I think, a failure of leadership to grapple that. Something that even John McDonnell has since admitted that Corbyn didn't have the ability to get hold of that and to stop it. And so in people's mind, I think that translates into a question of, well, can you run the country if you can't run the Labour Party? So I think it spoke to styles of leadership as well. It was to do with the scale on which it occurred, but I wasn't suggesting that he was virtuous prior to 2019.
Other questions? Oh, loads, David.
I think how much of this, because what the conference is like Johnsonism, but how much of this is part of a change that's kind of taking as part of the Conservative Party towards a new, more interventionist position? So the 2019 leadership election was primarily contested on 2 polls. One was how far are you willing to go to get Brexit done, and the other one was how far are you willing to break with kind of traditional conservative economic policy and invest in basically letting it up. And Johnson was, you know, going to win anyway. So you know how he loved, but people like Andrea Leadsom, people like Michael Gove, even Sajid Javid, Dominic Raab all spoke about the need to spend more money on public services. I think the only one who was kind of against that type was Mark Harper. Well, that was not a leadership bit, was it? That was just embarrassing. So, and then Matt Hancock just spoke about apps, and the whole thing was just a contest of who could basically spend the most money and still sound fiscally credible. So, I mean, if I worked for the IA, that would depress me. But
we're very depressed.
Yeah. But so, how much of this is Johnson reshaping his party, or how much of it is a broader time kind of history of conservative ideology?
Should we throw this one to Tim? Did you pick that up, Tim?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, if my answer bears no relevance to it, clearly I misheard. I mean, I think the 2019 election, what was offered then, and in some ways what's been offered since, is in part just a sort of swing of the pendulum. I think there was a feeling that things had gone too far during the so-called age of austerity. Conservative Party was picking up from polling that people were beginning to worry a great deal about public services, in particular National Health Service, in particular schools, and to some extent policing as well. And there was just a sense that that needed to be responded to. And as David said, I think the key thing to think about when you're thinking about the 2019 general election is that it wasn't just a promise to get Brexit done. It was a promise to get Brexit done in order to get back to the priorities of the British people. And those priorities at the time, anyway, were to spend more money on public services. I think that's very clear. And I think that's the message the Conservative Party picked up.
You heard the question. Good. Great. Other questions in the room? Go on.
Is the Conservative Party still Conservative?
Do you want to do it in a word or two, everybody? Gut instinct. Yes. Victoria?
No.
No. Tim?
Well, to go with the theme of the conference, it depends on what you mean by conservative.
Yeah. Which we sort of started, which does bring us kind of full circle. And at 2 minutes to 4, unless anyone's got a burning question, I'm happy to. We've got another tea break.
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Good. I think
another panel to go.
We have got one more panel to go, which we start at 4:30. That was fascinating. Thank you to Nick Timothy, obviously, for his pre-record. Thank you to Victoria. Thank you to Antony. Thank you to Tim. Thank you to all your questions. Really great discussion. I think it sort of has tied up a lot of what we've spoken about today. So thanks very much. We'll give you a round of applause.